Hi, I'm Alex Leung from UBS-Asset Management. I'm the infrastructure research analyst on the infrastructure research and strategy team. I think there will be a lot of telecommunication investments for high-speed internet. So that would include data centers, fiber investments, and also to lower tier cities, smaller cities, and as I said, lower income neighborhoods. Renewable energy will remain a very important part of the investment landscape. But even within renewable energy, I think the industry is kind of moving beyond just plain vanilla wind farms and solar farms. Even last year, you're already seeing a lot more hype about batteries and energy storage, and I think that's gonna increase further. In 2021, a lot of these projects have become more and more economic around the country. And beyond energy storage, because of the incoming Biden administration, I think offshore wind will also gain more traction. Obviously, offshore wind is already very mature over in Europe, but in the US, it is still a very small sector. But with the new Biden administration, there's actually a lot of things that they can do, even without congressional approval, in terms of leasing out more federal waters for new project development, streamlining federal regulatory approval. So there are many things that can happen. And even in recent months, despite the COVID-19 pandemic, you're seeing states like New Jersey and New York still continuing with very aggressive offshore wind tenders, and they've all been quite successful. Because of the pandemic, people realize how important it is to have the right fiscal stimulus and to have various infrastructure programs around the world to reinvigorate the economy, to create new jobs, to really help the world recover from this crisis. And so it's taken although politicians love talking about infrastructure every year, you hear them talking about it, I think there's definitely a new level of urgency this time around, because it is really the infrastructure spending is the most tried and true method of creating new jobs and helping economy while it's in recession. The problem, I guess, is that a lot of governments around the world don't have the money. That's the big issue. A lot of this spending is premised on tax raises, for example, because yeah, the governments don't have money, and U.S. debt, federal debt versus GDP is probably at the highest level since World War II. And I think a lot of governments around the world are also kind of fiscally strained right now, and I think that's kind of why it is important for the private sector to be involved. Because if you look at the private infrastructure industry, it's sitting on more than $200 billion of dry powder right now, and this doesn't even include the debt that they can take on. So there's a lot of spending power there, and they're hungry to deploy this capital, and so it's really up to the public and the private sector to work together to kind of formulate various structures and ways to help deploy this capital, especially when again public sector finances are a little bit strained right now. I think there are several things to look at. First of all, from a policy point of view, as I alluded to, I think governments around the world, including the U.S. government and the incoming administration, is aware that they need to get the private sector involved, even in Biden's investment plans. He's often mentioned how important it is for a private sector to drive innovation, especially since the next wave of investments or infrastructure investments will probably have more of a ESG or greener element to it. And a lot of the innovation in these sectors has happened in the private sector. So governments will have to make the right incentives, whether it is from research and development point of view, offering tax credits or various subsidies in order to drive these kinds of investments. And this isn't just in the US, even in Europe, they have a 1 trillion euro Green Deal that they've talked about. And the European Commission president actually said that governments alone cannot carry this burden. They need to involve the private sector. And they mentioned, for example, that the European Investment Bank, which is the financing arm of the EU, can provide guarantees to what they call crowd in private sector investments. So I think people are aware that certain things have to be done to help private investors deploy capital in the sector. I think the main focus for 2021 is obviously how we'll recover from the COVID-19 crisis. And that really will be related to how quickly vaccines will be rolled out across various regions. And I think a key point that we try to highlight in the report is that infrastructure assets aren't homogeneous. There are many different sectors and subsectors across different geographies. And so the recovery rates are going to be very different across the board. And I think during the crisis, it was pretty obvious that telecommunication assets like data centers and fiber networks, those have benefited. But a lot of other subsectors have actually been surprisingly resilient, and people not in the industry might not be as aware of this. For example, even within transports, a lot of people are so focused on how empty the airports are these days. What they don't realize is that even within transport, if you look at freight transportation, not passenger transportation, freight transportation has actually done pretty well. It's been pretty resilient. You look at U.S. port volumes, for example, they've pretty much been flat versus 2019. And even if you look at freight railings, container volumes, all these different data, the recovery has been pretty strong, and they've been recovering pretty nicely. So again, there are a lot of different subsectors that we try to highlight in our report. And I think just given the 2020 elections, 2021 is also going to be a year where a lot of people will be focused on policies, on the new administration, on various macro factors such as fiscal spending stimulus. So those are things that we also try to highlight within the report.